Perfect. Good afternoon or good morning, depending where you're joining us from. My name is Christy Allen. I am the Knowledge Translation and Implementation Coordinator at the Waypoint Research Institute, and welcome to another great session of Waypoint Talks. We're very excited to have you joining us today. Very excited to be joined by Dr. April Joliffe Simpson to talk about improving prediction of intimate partner violence by identifying coercive controlling behaviors in police reports. So we have a couple intro slides to get us started, and then we will pass it over to our speaker to lead off today's session. We'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. The Waypoint Research Institute is located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabeg, which include the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations, collectively known as the Three Fires Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee, Huron, Wendat, and Métis peoples. We acknowledge and affirm our commitment to improving relationships between nations and to improving equity for Indigenous communities residing in the Central North region of Ontario. So welcome again to Waypoint Talks. This is a virtual webinar series hosted by the Waypoint Research Institute, aiming to highlight the practical implications of research projects. We have another series under Waypoint Talks around building your research toolkit. So the series aims to highlight best practices used in mental health research, quality improvement, and program implementation. And these events are open to all who are interested in learning about emerging research, best practices, and clinical innovation. Just a couple housekeeping notes as we get started. So Waypoint Talks is hosted as a Zoom webinar, so please use the chat box and Q&A function to connect with speakers and fellow attendees. And there will be dedicated time at the end of the presentation for questions and discussion. If you would like to ask questions throughout, I encourage you to use the Q&A box just so we can keep track of those. The recording and slides will be available post-event on the WRI website. And we do ask that you complete our post-event survey to share your feedback and help improve future Waypoint Talks events. There's also attendance certificates available for professional development for attending this session, and we'll share a little bit more about how to access those at the end of the presentation. We also are hoping to learn a little bit more about who is in the audience today before we get started. So we're going to ask folks to participate in a quick Zoom poll just to learn about where you're joining us from and a little bit about your background in the sector that you work in. So we can go ahead and launch our quick 2-question poll now. Perfect. So you should see that on the screen there, and we'll give folks about a minute to fill that out. Okay, hopefully everyone has had a chance to participate. So I think we can go ahead and close the poll now. Perfect, thank you. With that, I will pass it over to Dr. Zoe Hilton to share more about this Waypoint Talk series and introduce you to our speakers. So Zoe, over to you.
Thank you, Christy. So the Waypoint Talks Fall series on coercive control is part of a project on understanding, defining, and assessing coercive control. This project is supported in part by funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. The goals of our project include connecting academic and community-based researchers to identify knowledge gaps and research directions and opportunities for cross-disciplinary research on coercive control in Canada, and also engaging the broader public on discussing these issues. A first step in this project is to enhance our knowledge of how coercive control is studied and responded to outside of Canada. And so I'd like to thank the Waypoint Research Institute for its support of this work through this Waypoint Talks series. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Dr. April Jolliffe-Simpson is a lecturer at Te Puna Haumaru, New Zealand Institute for Security and Crime Science at the University of Waikato. Dr. Jolliffe-Simpson conducts research on family violence and whānau, or extended family violence, including decision-making, coercive control, risk assessment, and case management by family violence practitioners. She is one of the few researchers internationally to have conducted research on the relationship between controlling behavior and intimate partner violence re-victimization, as well as studying risk assessments by police officers and family violence practitioners. Dr. Jolliffe-Simpson is an emerging scholar, having received her PhD from the University of Waikato, New Zealand in 2022. So, Dr. Jolliffe-Simpson, a warm welcome to Waypoint Talks.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Zoe, for that warm welcome. It's an honour and a privilege to be able to speak with you all today. So as Zoe said, today I'm here to talk to you about some research that we've done examining the extent to which identifying evidence of controlling behaviours in police reports for family violence, specifically intimate partner violence, can improve prediction for re-victimization. And while I'm the person who gets to speak with you today, I'm going to talk to you about two studies, the first of which includes work from some of my awesome colleagues. So on the left here, we can see Samantha Taka, and on the right is Professor Devon Polaschek. This first study that I'm going to talk about is work that we did together for Samantha's honours dissertation a few years ago. And we're now finally getting around to getting it ready for publication. So I'm on the other side of the world in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's currently just gone 7 a.m. And in addition to being on the other side of the world, we've got quite a different way of conceptualizing the problem of family and intimate partner violence. So legislation in Aotearoa, New Zealand defines family violence as physical, sexual, or psychological violence inflicted against a person with whom the aggressor is or has been in a family relationship with. And this is even more broadly defined with reference to the Māori concept of whānau. So whānau is the concept where family is basically the people who you have the strongest relationship. So this could extend to extended family members or even maybe friends who you either live with or have a close family relationship with. So when we're talking about family violence, we're talking about the kinds of harm that happen in those relationships. And what that means is, in addition to talking about intimate partners, we're often also considering harm to children, harms that children perpetrate to parents, harm between siblings, and even harm between or to elder people in our families. And likewise, in addition to considering relationships broadly, we also think about physical harm, property damage, psychological harm, sexual violence, verbal abuse, and coercive control. Today, though, I do want to specifically focus on coercive control, which makes sense given that this series is about research on coercive control and controlling behaviours. And the way that I'm conceptualising coercive control is in line with the way that it's been conceptualised in other research, as an intentional pattern of harmful behaviour used over time to control and dominate the life of another person. Increasing attention is being given to a coercive control, and we're recognizing that it can include many different kinds of behaviors. So things like monitoring a partner's location, threatening to leave a relationship, making it difficult for the partner to work or study, using nasty looks or gestures to make the partner feel bad about themselves, acting suspicious or jealous, restricting time that partners can spend with family or friends, causing them to question their own sanity or judgment, and threatening to disclose embarrassing information, among other kinds of behaviours. And importantly, these behaviours are perceived by victims as being harmful and coercive. Some evidence is found that coercive control or behaviours that could be part of a pattern of coercive control are actually relatively common among women in New Zealand. So Fanslow and colleagues conducted a survey and they estimated that approximately 1/10 of New Zealand women had experienced at least one act of economic abuse from an intimate partner in their lifetime. A fifth had experienced at least one isolating act, and around half of New Zealand women had experienced at least one act of humiliation, threats, or intimidation. So together, that's a pretty high prevalence of controlling behaviours. And alongside the well-documented negative health and well-being impacts that these behaviours can have for victims, these things together position coercive control and controlling behaviours as a priority issue for researchers and practitioners alike. So really, as a result of that, coercive control has been criminalised in some countries. Several countries have introduced legislation creating crimes for using coercive control, which importantly can provide victims access to services and give police the power to arrest people who are using a pattern of controlling behaviours. In addition to that, coercive control and controlling behaviours have been identified as forms of harm in their own right, but also as potential risk factors or indications that intimate partner violence will continue or escalate. And indeed, Myhill and Hole have described coercive control as a golden thread that captures the range of strategies that aggressors can use to control and dominate the lives of their partner, and thereby creating an environment in which other situational risk factors that emerge can further increase risk. So it kind of explains how all these risks might come together as a constellation of factors. So accordingly, coercive controlling behaviours have been included in many different risk assessment instruments created for intimate partner violence, designed to indicate the likelihood of ongoing or escalating harm. But for coercive control offences to be successfully prosecuted and for the presence of coercive controlling behaviours to adequately inform risk judgments, frontline police must be able to identify those controlling behaviours when they're attending call-outs and also record evidence of those behaviours in their reports. And it might not surprise you that those things aren't necessarily guaranteed. Several factors might impede this process in practice, including the inconsistent conceptualization of coercive control as a phenomenon, and therefore disagreement about what behaviours actually are controlling, as well as police officers' focus on identifying physical violence, the often hidden nature of controlling behaviours themselves, as well as the fact that police officers tend to treat intimate partner violence episodes or calls for service as discrete incidents that require resolution, rather than episodes in a broader context of ongoing abuse. So that means they might attend an event on a given day without reviewing or really understanding the purported history between the people involved. And underlying all of that is the fact that even if attending officers are aware of controlling behaviours, they might underestimate their importance or neglect to record their presence, especially in jurisdictions where coercive control has not been criminalised, like in New Zealand. Recognising the barriers that police experience to identifying and recording contextual factors, such as coercive control, in 2018, New Zealand Police launched a new approach, which is called Eyes Wide Open. And this approach encouraged officers to notice factors outside of the offences that they're trained to detect, with the point really being that these factors might indicate the potential for ongoing harm. So things like coercion, threats, controlling behaviours, poverty, and even things like unsafe or unsanitary living conditions. So the idea with this approach is that police would notice those things and perhaps make referrals to support services that can more adequately address needs that are identified. And in addition to this approach, officers use risk assessment instruments to inform their approach. So they have a static assessment, which is called the Static Assessment of Family Violence Recidivism. That instrument is calculated by a computerized algorithm for the person who's identified in the aggressor in the episode, and it pops up on the officer's devices as a categorical label, so either low, moderate, or high risk. And in addition to that, they complete a dynamic assessment by asking the victim at the episode some questions. And while the static assessment has moderate predictive validity, it only accounts for static factors that are related to the aggressor's criminal history, and that means it doesn't capture things like controlling behaviours. And on the other hand, the dynamic assessment is intended to capture changeable risk factors and has one item that asks about whether an aggressor is being jealous or controlling, but the instrument has poor predictive validity and it's often left incomplete. So in this study, we wanted to just use the safer. So in this first study that I'm going to talk to you about, the research questions we had were really, to what extent do police officers record information about controlling behaviours in their reports for intimate partner violence episodes? And to what extent can including that evidence of controlling behaviours improve prediction of recurrence? So that's having another call out. And physical harm within any of those call-outs over and above police's existing static risk assessment instrument, the SAFER. So despite New Zealand Police taking that eyes wide open approach, in New Zealand we don't have an offence for coercive control, and so therefore we were interested in the extent to which evidence of controlling behaviours were being recorded anyway. So the data for this study came from 2 policing districts in New Zealand, which you can see shaded in this map. So one in the North Island, which is the Waikato region, which is where I'm currently located, and one in the South Island, which is the Canterbury region, which is very, very large area. So it's really parts of Canterbury and closer to the urban areas. And in these regions, we have a multi-agency response to family violence operating. So in these areas, every report to police, regardless of risk level, is referred on to the multi-agency response for further risk assessment, triaging, and case management. And so that brings together organisations like our Ministry of Health, Ministry for Social Development, Police, Department of Corrections, as well as non-governmental organisations providing services in those areas. So through our relationship with that multi-agency response, we were able to record just over 1,000 reports for intimate partner violence episodes that were reported between November 2018 in those Waikato and Canterbury regions. And again, there were any risk levels, any genders. We just restricted the sample to episodes where the aggressor and victim who were identified were in some kind of current or former intimate relationship. Next, we coded 5 types of controlling behaviours, and we used a simplified form of the controlling behaviours scale revised to use to make these classifications. So that scale really has 5 subscales within it, which record evidence of economic, emotional, intimidating, isolating, and threatening control. So I coded a portion of the episodes, and Samantha Taka coded all of the episodes, and we conducted inter-rater reliability for the overlapping portion to ensure that we were making the classifications reliably enough. And because we were just coding evidence in police reports and doing it manually, we used the items in the controlling behaviour scale within each subscale as our guide as to define these 5 dichotomous variables. So we just coded the presence or absence of each type. We didn't have the granularity of data necessary to code all of the items, and instead we used the items as indicators for the types. Next, we collected reports for intimate partner violence episodes involving those same two people from the index episode that were reported over the next 6 months. And yes, again, it was the aggressor again in the aggressor role and the same victim. And from those reports, we coded recurrence, which is just defined as having a further report, and physical harm, which is where there was harm recorded, physical harm recorded in those subsequent reports. And we analysed the associations between police's SAFER, the static risk instrument, the 5 types of controlling behaviours, and those outcome measures, recurrence and physical harm. And based on prior research, we had some hypotheses about what we expect to find in this study. So there's been other research using the controlling behaviour scale in population samples and through review of police reports, and as well separately, not using the scale, but just examining police reports through text mining, for example. So based on those, we expected to find relatively low rates of controlling behaviours, so being present in fewer than a third of cases, with emotional and isolating control being more present, being more often present than economic, threatening, and intimidating control. And in line with research that's established a relationship between controlling behaviours and physical violence, we expected that including evidence of controlling behaviours would improve prediction of recurrence and physical harm over and above using the SAFER alone, police's static instrument. So first, I'll just tell you a bit about the index episodes. So I've got some reports here representing the sample, and physical harm was present in just under a third of episodes in the initial sample. So I think that this is reflecting that broad view that we take of family violence in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So a large proportion of what's reported to police does not necessarily include physical harm. And an even smaller proportion of index episodes included offences being detected, so just over a tenth. And again, that reflects the broad conceptualisation we take of what constitutes family violence. When we looked at whether cases included any evidence of controlling behaviour in that index episode, we found that just under half, so 41.5% of the index episodes included at least one kind of controlling behaviour. And when we broke that down, the most common type that we identified in the index episodes was isolating control, which was present in about a quarter of the index episodes. Threatening control was present in about a fifth of index episodes. Intimidating control was present in just under a tenth. Emotional control was present in about 7.6%. And finally, when we looked at our outcomes, economic control was present in 6%. And then finally, when we looked at our outcomes, just under half of cases in the sample had a recurrence reported within that 6-month follow-up. So 43%, which was quite high. But again, that could be any kind of episode, not necessarily including physical harm. When we looked at whether there was any physical harm in the recurrences, 17.6% of the cases had a recurrence with physical harm present within the follow-up period. So now let's turn our attention to our analyses answering the second research question. We first just looked at the ability of police's existing static risk assessment instrument to predict recurrence. So we looked first at the SAFER. And the SAFER was associated with recurrence, unsurprisingly, because its predictive validity has already been established. And what we found specifically was that people who were in the moderate risk category had increased odds of a recurrence compared with people in the who had not answered, who had no score, which is kind of equivalent to not having a criminal history, given that the instrument is created based on criminal history variables that are held by police and our Ministry of Justice. And we also found that people who were in the high risk category had increased odds of recurrence compared with people who didn't have a score. So that's quite comforting, because that's what we would hope that the instrument would be able to do. when we turned our attention to adding those evidence of any kind of controlling behaviours, the 5 types, over and above the static instrument, we found that the model was statistically significant, with slightly improved ability to predict the outcome. But we found, again, that the static instrument had the same kind of pattern, but that of the 5 types of controlling behaviours, only evidence of economic control independently contributed to the model, whereby it increased odds of recurrence occurring. So it looked like there's something important about economic control here. Then we looked at physical harm, and again, we first just looked at the static instrument. Again, we found that it had a relationship with our outcome measure, whereby people who were in the high risk category have greater odds of, and there was no difference between the low risk category and people with no score, and also with the moderate risk category and people with low score. So it looked here like high risk was particularly important. And then when we added the 5 types of controlling behaviours, we found that it didn't actually significantly improve model fit, but the model was still statistically significant. And again, we observed the same pattern where people in the high risk category of the safer had greater odds, as did people who had economic control present in the index episode. So just to summarise that, in that first study, we found police did record some evidence of controlling behaviours in their reports for intimate partner violence episodes, with isolating and threatening control being the most common types. And we found that including evidence of controlling behaviours improved prediction of recurrence and physical harm, but only to a small degree above police's existing static risk assessment instrument, which performed quite well. And we saw that economic control uniquely contributed to that predictive ability, but the other kinds of controlling behaviours didn't. So what are the implications of this? Well, on one hand, our findings might reflect the kind of controlling behaviours that are more likely to be reported to police. So, for example, if you are going through a relationship separation and experiencing some kinds of financial abuse, for example, you've got a great incentive to report that because it's having an impact on your daily life or ability to separate, for example. So maybe that's why people might be reporting economic control. But on the other hand, we saw, for example, that isolating control was really common, and maybe that's something police were asking people about. We can't really tell. So it could actually be that our results reflect the types of controlling behaviours that attending officers who are present at intimate partner violence episodes are more likely to detect and record. So it could be that the kind of insults or put downs, for example, weren't coming through as much. Those are the things that would be considered emotional control in our study. In population surveys, those appear to be really prevalent, but maybe they're not the kinds of things that people are telling police about. These rates that we observed were in line with what we saw in other research looking at police reports in other jurisdictions, which is promising. It suggests that our police aren't recording to a lesser degree, despite us not having an offence for coercive control. But yeah, they weren't in line with our expectations about what types of controlling behaviours would be more common. And actually, overall, when you looked at evidence of any kind of controlling behaviour, that was actually quite common. The findings with regard to the second research question provide a really small degree of support for efforts to incorporate measures of coercive control and risk assessment instruments for IPV. But the predictive validity, the increase in that we observed was smaller than we expected. We thought that this would really have quite a big impact and perhaps that more of the controlling behaviours, on one hand, it could be that our variables weren't recorded that well. We were relying on what police notice and record and what we then could code from that. But on the other hand, it could actually also be that antisocial characteristics that are related to criminal history and therefore captured in the static risk assessment instrument were also captured by our controlling behaviours, and the overlap between those two things meant that the controlling behaviours weren't adding too much over and above the static factors related to the criminal history of the aggressor. So there could be perhaps a common characteristic that is relevant to understanding coercive control. Of course, this study was not without limitations. I'm sure that as you were listening to me, you had some in mind, like, oh, what about this? And it's definitely the case that I mentioned earlier that coercive control is conceptualized as a pattern of behavior over time. And we just looked at evidence of controlling behavior in a single episode. So we can't really say in that study that we were looking at coercive control. We were just looking at evidence of controlling behaviors in police reports. Again, we are relying on stuff being reported to police. In New Zealand, reporting rates for family violence don't appear to be too much lower than reporting rates for other kinds of crime. But with that huge grain of salt, that reporting rates in general for crime are quite low. So we estimate that maybe about a third of offences between family members are reported to police. And that's based on our New Zealand Crime and Victims Survey run by the Ministry of Justice. So we've got low reporting rates here. And of course, the fact that if coercive control is present, that in itself could be preventing reporting. So it's highly likely that what we're seeing in police reports is not representing the full experience or the full presence, in fact, of controlling behaviours in our community. And finally, something that really impeded our ability to record information in this first study is the fact that there's really not enough information in low-risk cases. So if you think back to when I presented the characteristics of the index episodes and how infrequently things like physical harm were present, many episodes are, on the surface at least, appear quite low risk. And so there's not a huge amount of information recorded. For example, it might just say that some people had an argument and they told police that things were fine. And so for our purposes, there really wasn't enough information there to be able to code about the dynamics that were happening and detect evidence of controlling behaviours. More of that tended to be present in the moderate and high risk cases where there were more detailed reports and kind of an account from both sides about what had been going on, even in the lead up to the event of the day. And on top of that, of course, there are more outcomes that we could consider over and above just looking at recurrence in physical violence. So really, we're interested in further episodes. Is there controlling behaviours again? Like, is there evidence of controlling behaviours in episodes over time? And that might help us actually get at whether coercive control is being evidenced in police reports. And above that, just indications of physical harm don't really get at severity. So we also want to know about injuries and offences and things like that. So I want to talk to you about a second study that we did, and this built on the work that Samantha Taka and Professor Devin Plaszczyk and I did that I've just talked to you about. And we added in our lovely colleague, Dr. Jordan Tompkins, who recently completed her PhD. And we worked together to include and code this broader range of information so that we could understand things a bit more deeply. So in the second study, we wanted to answer the research question, to what extent is evidence of controlling behaviours in police reports for intimate partner violence episodes related to recurrence, physical harm, further controlling behaviour, injuries and offences. So we've got a broader range of things that we were looking at this time. So for this study, we collected reports for 629 IPV episodes. We limited the sample from that original sample to episodes of intimate partner violence where the aggressor was a man and the victim was a woman, so that we kind of had a more uniform sample. We've just focused on medium and high risk cases for that reason I gave before about how there wasn't really enough information in the low risk cases, but the locations and the time period were the same. Again, we coded those 5 types of controlling behaviours based on the controlling behaviour scale revised, which was economic, emotional, intimidating, isolating, and threatening control. And we collected the reports within the next 6 months with the same aggressor and same victims. And we took any kinds of episodes involving those people and we coded these outcomes with respect to the aggressor using harm towards the victim. So we coded whether there was a recurrence, whether there was physical harm to the victim, whether the aggressor used any kind of controlling behaviour to the victim in the subsequent reports, whether the victim had injuries as a result of the aggressor's physical harm, and also whether there were any offences detected. And like before, we analysed these associations with binary logistic regressions. So based on research that conceptualizes coercive control as a pattern of controlling behaviours over time, for this second study, we hypothesized that evidence of controlling behaviours would be associated with further controlling behaviours. And like before, based on research that establishes a relationship between controlling behaviours and physical harm, we predicted that evidence of controlling behaviours would be associated with recurrence, physical harm, injuries, and offences, with those later measures just being really an indication of severity over and above the measures that we had in the previous study. So again, just looking at the characteristics of the index episodes in the sample, they are really similar to the previous sample, of course, because this is really a subset, but you'll see that it's slightly higher in risk. So rather than being present in just under a third of episodes, physical harm in this sample was present in 36.7% of index episodes, and offences were present in about a fifth of index episodes. And we found any evidence of controlling behaviours in 45.8% of the index episodes, which is slightly higher than the 2/5 in the previous sample. When we looked at the evidence of the 5 kinds of controlling behaviours that we looked at, isolating control was present in 28.1% of index episodes, so just under a third now. Threatening control in 21.5%. Intimidating control, in about a 10th. Emotional control in about a 10th. And finally, economic control in 6.8% of index episodes. Turning our attention to our outcomes, we found recurrence was present in 57.4% of cases in this sample, so that's more than half compared to just under half in the last sample. Physical harm was present in about a quarter in repeat episodes, so in the recurrences, about a quarter included physical harm. And interestingly, controlling behaviour was present in about a quarter of cases had them in their recurrences. So it was about a third of cases that had controlling behaviour in the index episode had cases with controlling behaviour as recurrences, but also about a fifth of cases that didn't have controlling behaviours in their index episode had controlling behaviours in their recurrences. So that was really interesting. We didn't identify it at the index, but then there was evidence later on. Injuries were present in about a 10th of cases and offences in about a fifth. And all of those figures that I just presented about things that were present in recurrences is still within the whole sample. So the rate of those was actually higher among cases that did have recurrence because it's just like for the overall sample, how many cases had these things. So now answering the research question, this time we just looked at the 5 types of controlling behaviours. And when we looked at whether we could use those to predict recurrence, we found that we couldn't. The model was not statistically significant. When we included the SAFER, the static measure, it was, but the controlling behaviours on their own could not predict recurrence among these moderate and high risk cases. When we look to physical harm, including the 5 types of controlling behaviours, we could predict physical harm with quite a small pseudo I-squared. So not the most amazing model fit, but they were associated with the outcome measure. And it was interesting here because, again, we observed that economic control was associated with greater odds of physical harm, but we saw that threatening control was associated with decreased odds, which really caused us to wonder perhaps if that could be something to do with the police response and the multi-agency response, remembering that all cases in the sample were referred to a multi-agency response for further risk assessment and triaging. It suggests that perhaps when threats are present, that either that response or the victim's response is doing something to prevent physical harm from occurring, which could be good news. When we looked at whether the 5 types of controlling behaviours could predict further evidence of controlling behaviours in police reports, again, we found that the model was statistically significant, better model fit than for predicting physical harm, but we found that of the 5 types of controlling behaviours, it was isolating control, which really hasn't popped out for us before, which had the greatest, well, actually was the only type of controlling behaviour that uniquely contributed to the model's ability to predict further controlling behaviour. So it looks like something to do with isolating controlling behaviours. So, for example, preventing victims from being able to spend time with friends and family members, and so on and so forth, being jealous. It looks like something to do with those was associated with further reports with evidence of controlling behaviour, which perhaps after a relationship separation, of course, we included current partners as well, but one idea that I have about why we see this might be that in relationships where stalking adjacent behaviours occur after a separation, a lot of that could look like isolating control just in the way that we measured it. And so perhaps that could be the reason why there were further reports with evidence of controlling behaviours for some cases. When we looked at whether the controlling behaviours were associated with injuries, we weren't able to find an association there. And also when we looked at offences, we found that the model was not statistically significant. In this model, there was a relationship between emotional control and offences, but again, the model wasn't statistically significant. So just to sum that up, that was a lot of results. We found in this next study that evidence of controlling behaviours was associated with physical harm and recurrences for these moderate and high-risk cases, with economic control being associated with increased odds of physical harm, threatening control being associated with decreased odds. And we also found that controlling behaviours beget controlling behaviours, with isolating control in particular being associated with increased odds. On the other hand, we found that just simply looking at evidence of controlling behaviours wasn't enough to predict recurrence, injuries, or offences. And out of interest, we also looked at non-fatal strangulation and evidence of victim fear in follow-up episodes, and we weren't able to establish a relationship there either, perhaps due simply to having low rates of those kinds of outcomes. What does this all mean? Well, I think it's really promising that we did find that evidence of controlling behaviours was associated with further evidence of controlling behaviours. It's really some preliminary evidence, I think, that New Zealand police could potentially evidence coercive control if it became an offence in New Zealand. And again, we found a small degree of support for efforts to incorporate measures of coercive control into risk assessment instruments for intimate partner violence. There doesn't appear to be any kind of calls or momentum for us to have coercive controlling behaviours as a criminal offence in New Zealand just yet. In our Family Violence Act, the Act does include a pattern of behaviours intended to coerce or control a person in the definition of family violence. So when you look at the legislation, it's in there, and that means people can access things like special leave from work, if they need it, for example, to get out of a situation, and support services can be accessed. So it's in the legislation, but it's not in our Crimes Act. So police aren't equipped at the moment to respond with arrests if they notice it occurring. So instead, people who police detect and for some reason decide to support further or linked with services, they can absolutely do that, but it's not through the criminal pathway at the moment. The only way that coercive controlling behaviours can be criminalised indirectly at the moment in New Zealand is through victims getting protection orders through the courts, and then once they have a protection order, behaviours that constitute coercive controlling behaviours would constitute breaches of protection orders, and that's how they would be able to be prosecuted. So yeah, it's interesting to see the extent to which having an offence would improve our ability to respond in these cases where coercive control is occurring, especially given the evidence from other countries where bringing in this offence, on one hand, increase the identification of coercive control and potentially responses to it, but has led to a lot of challenges in evidencing coercive control just due to the nature of the behaviours that can be controlling. So again, this second study was not without limitations. Of course, we relied on episodes that were reported to police. And again, like I said before, we think that about a third of family violence offences, at least, are reported to police. We're not actually sure about the proportion of that broader spectrum of harm that's reported to police because it's not picked up in our crime and victim surveys, which focus on offences. So we know that this is just a reflection of what's coming to police attention, and that's really reflected in the aims that from the outset we wanted to know what officers were detecting and recording and the utility of that information for their practice. And the next step from that really is just to acknowledge that researchers coding evidence from police reports is not necessarily evidence that police recognise those behaviours as controlling. The way that our police reports are structured is that there's a police summary of the episode, then there's a summary from either the victim's point of view or the aggressor's point of view, and then the other person's point of view if they're spoken to. And so sometimes when we were coding this evidence, we weren't seeing it in the police summary, we were seeing it in police's recording of what the victim said was happening or what the aggressor said was happening. And so it isn't clear to us from the way we coded things the extent to which police were recording that information because they thought it was controlling behaviour, or just if it was a description of the couple's interactions, and we then came in and perceived those as being controlling behaviours. And the next step from that is also to acknowledge that a fundamental component of coercive control as a phenomena is the victim's perception of those behaviours as coercive. So, of course, these things are culturally bound. There might be certain situations where a given behaviour is seen as desirable or even helpful. For example, isolating a person from their family if their family is harming them could be quite an adaptive thing to do. And it's about or for example, monitoring or checking someone's location can be very sinister, but it could also be a thing that you do in your relationship so that dinner's ready when the person comes home, and both partners feel very happy about that. So this fundamental component of the victim's perceptions of the function of those behaviours and the impact of those behaviours, whether they're coercive, that's something we just couldn't capture because we're really a few steps removed from what's actually going on for people. So there's lots of things that come out of this that I'd like to see happen and that I would like to do. Some clear things are the fact that, in my view, just based on what I was saying before about the structure of police reports and how we were reading these free text fields, I really think that standardized recording practices may improve the quality and the utility of information about controlling behaviours. And importantly, I'm not just saying that as a researcher who always wants better data for research. It's not just that, it's also the fact that I think that the results here do actually have some preliminary evidence that picking up these behaviours could be important for understanding the pattern of harm that's happening for people, and perhaps then being more attuned and responding better to that. But if we are just instructing police to have their eyes wide open and not necessarily anchoring them to the things that they should be noticing and recording evidence of and passing on to that multi-agency response, we're not really supporting them enough to have their eyes wide open, because we can't just tell people notice everything. It's like asking someone, tell me everything. They're going to miss stuff out. So I really think that if we could create some way of drawing officers' attention systematically to behaviours that are worthy of noticing or even asking victims about, then that might, without increasing their workloads, importantly, that might better equip them to record this information. And then if we do have an offence for coercive control brought in, that would help them be able to evidence it and really support victims who are reporting by capturing and responding to the full range of things that the victims are experiencing as harmful. And so on that note, I think it would be really useful to compare victims' perceptions of controlling behaviours with police perceptions to identify if there are specific behaviours that are currently undetected. And one of the main reasons why I think that would be useful is because the population surveys that have used the controlling behaviours scale find much higher rates of certain kinds of control, like, for example, emotional control, than we observed in our reports. And I really do think that there are certain things that victims themselves might not see as being as important or as harmful or worthy of sharing with someone whose primary job is to detect and respond to offences. And it might well be the case that they're not related with outcomes. They could be, but they still represent part of the constellation of harmful behaviours that victims are experiencing. So they're worthy of factoring in, especially when all that information is being passed on to a multi-agency response that's intended to connect people with services to improve both their safety and their well-being. So I'd actually like to open things up for questions now. I'm interested in what you all think. Thank you all for watching this presentation, and a huge thank you to my amazing colleagues, Samantha Taka, Dr. Jordan Tompkins, and Professor Devin Blaszczyk, and also to the people in the data, which we accessed from New Zealand Police and the Integrated Safety Response. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joliffe Simpson, for your presentation. It's really exciting for me to hear about the research that is so new, and I think it's so relevant for us in Canada as well, because we don't have a criminal offence of coercive control yet either, but it may be criminalized soon. And I really appreciated your next steps. As a researcher, I think this idea of comparing police and victim perceptions is so important to how we can understand how the police can help in cases of coercive control. So I'd like to start off the questions, if I may, by asking you, like, in terms of your next steps for standardized police reporting practices, how do you think that police could ask about coercive control during family violence incidents? And especially thinking about what you said, that if coercive control is happening, then it might prevent people from reporting just by its very nature. So how would you suggest police could ask about coercive control?
That is a great question. And I should have mentioned police do have standardized recording practices, but it's more about, the way the reports are formatted. And they do have certain kinds of things they're meant to record, but to my knowledge, I don't think controlling behaviours are in there. They do, in their dynamic assessment, they do have one question that asks, is the aggressor jealous or controlling? So a place to start maybe could be with tweaking that question. And I think that there are just some issues with asking someone, are they controlling? I think instead of that, like we do in victimization surveys more generally, we should ask people about behaviors. So, is is the aggressor, or the person, whatever their name is that person making you feel restricted in some way? Like, are they preventing you from doing what you want to do, spending time with friends and family? Are they making you question yourself or feel bad about yourself? I think if we took the things that we think could constitute coercive control, we ask people about that. And then after asking them, are these things happening? We could then ask people, and how does that make you feel? Because it's not just the fact that it's happening, it's the fact that the person then feels like they're being coerced or controlled that makes it important. So it is potentially time intensive, but if our officers are taking this eyes wide open approach and they're coming in and they're saying, tell me about what's been happening, what other things have been going on in your relationship? Just that open questioning. And then it's that judgment of the victim's perception of what's going on that helps reflect if there's this pattern here. But again, acknowledging that this is when things are reported, that officers can ask those questions. So I suspect that really, really effective coercive control is not coming through here. Although, actually, with that said, we do have some cases in the sample where someone reports, and the reason they're reporting is like 6 years worth of controlling behaviours and harm that's now coming to police attention. So that actually does come through. And it is important that when that comes up, that officers then know how to respond. And rather than going, oh, well, we don't have an offence for that, going, okay, let's get you a protection order. Because then if they breach it by continuing this behaviour, we can do something and we can take it seriously. So I don't want to be cliche and say more training, but I think there's really concrete things that we can do to make it easier for officers without increasing workload.
That's great. Thank you so much. I'm going to open it up. You're getting a lot of wonderful feedback in the chat. It was a really great presentation, especially for being so early in the morning for you. Thank you. Please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A and to the chat as well. We just had one come in. So do you have any experience regarding what police officers know about coercive control, or whether they believe that asking about coercive control is important for their investigation?
Yes and no. So not in this study, but with a subsequent study with Professor Amanda Robinson, who I think you might have heard from recently, and our colleagues Federico Liberatore and Bevan Blaszczak. We did some interviews of family violence practitioners, so that included police, people delivering services to victims, people in health, so on and so forth. In New Zealand, in Spain, and in the UK. So that's another manuscript that we need to get written up. And in that study, it wasn't a main focus, but it did come up in some of the interviews. And so really, in all three countries, people were attuned to the fact that it was a form of harm. It was conceptualized as something that happens predominantly in relationships. I'm wondering if it also can happen in other kinds of family relationships, especially in New Zealand, where we do take that broader view of the relationships that this kind of harm can occur in. And it was understood as a priority, often from the perspective of not being able to respond as effectively as they'd like to. So we had some participants who talked about victims not wanting to participate in proceedings, providing evidence and then declining for evidence to be included, and the moral and ethical dilemma of whether you proceed with prosecutions against victims' wishes. So it was interesting that coercive control came up, in my view, in those interviews as predominantly reflecting a frustration and a reason why practitioners aren't always able to respond as effectively as they'd like to. Um, Rather than being conceptualized just as a form of harm in its own right, like it was seen as harmful, but it was seen as harmful because it prevented people from leaving relationships if that was seen as desirable, or it prevented people from accessing services or reporting and things like that. So it's seen as both a form of harm and a barrier to engagement.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And that has me also wondering, especially because it's not criminalized in New Zealand. And so police officers may understand kind of the limits of what they're able to do. So I'm also curious if you think maybe that is tied a little bit to the multi-agency approach that you mentioned. And maybe they're thinking, well, I can't do much here, but other folks who are in part of this agency can be a better support in this, the cases where coercive control is more present.
Yeah, I really think so. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing because in our country, we have got a bit of a problem with police workload and not having enough officers. And part of the reason for that is the fact that responding to family violence accounts for approximately 40% of frontline police time in our country. And with mental health calls also accounting for a lot of police time. And so, without seeing those things as not important, because they obviously are important, it's also about recognizing or questioning whether police are the right people or the best people to be responding in all of those cases. Sometimes they are when there's a risk to safety. But I actually think that I would feel comfortable in a place where police respond to emergencies, identify if they're not the right people, if they're not equipped for that, so long as the services to come in and fill the gap that police would leave are actually available and responsive and there quickly. So there's a fundamental assumption that they are there. And our multi-agency response is great in that they meet very quickly, often the next day. Well, that's kind of the desirable and expected time frame is that they meet the next day, definitely within 3 days. And they share information from their respective organizations that they hold that's relevant. So, for example, we've got our organization that deals with injury claims to fund things like medical or psychological treatment. And they might go, oh, well, this person has a history of falling down the stairs. That's really suspicious. Let's share that information. And perhaps someone has a history of care and protection or children currently in care and protection environments. And so that might be brought to the table and so on and so forth. Or even education might share stuff about truancy and behavior problems at school. And that gets brought together. They choose a risk category and then they also provide services to people. And the idea is really to reduce the number of cars up the driveway. So to pick a lead agency and then other agencies feed into that agency so that the family are getting what they need. And if that happens, then that is wonderful. And I think it's okay then for police to pass the baton. But I do still think that it's important for police to include quality information in their reports from the episodes, especially because in that moment where things come to a head, people might disclose things and be more open to discussions than even the next day they might be. They might recant or rescind or kind of put their walls up. So I do think that in that critical moment, it's important to record good quality information, but it could be a good thing if that's then passed on to other people to do something with.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We have a couple other questions coming in for you. So Would a multi-agency response information make it into police reports? And if not, then police reports don't really paint the whole picture when conducting research.
Yeah, absolutely. So the family safety system where we access the data from, it's kind of like each family has a plan, and connected with those plans are the episodes with the police reports, and also connected with the plan on like kind of the landing page for it are the case notes for each meeting that has occurred relating to the family. So there will be a meeting after each episode that's reported if there are multiple. And then if people are triaged as high risk, there are also further meetings to monitor the ongoing progress. So those case notes are in there and we can access them, and we did access them for the second study. We didn't access them for the first study because the purpose of that study was to look at the utility of information in police reports alone for prediction, just based on the way that risk assessment instruments are really geared and how they are often working from found objects, if you like. And then with the second study, we could look at a broader view of information. And you might be interested in Dr. Jordan Tompkins. We had a paper come out recently where we looked at specifically the high-risk cases and looked at all of the multi-agency information to talk about their psychosocial stresses, different kinds of re-victimization, and barriers that they experience. And it was interesting in that study, we found that evidence of non-fatal strangulation came out in the models almost as a protective factor, which we know it's not a protective factor, but it looked like the response was then doing something when that's identified that then prevented ongoing harm. So that's great news. But we found that non-engagement with services was came out kind of looking like a risk factor. So when people aren't engaging, that's indicative of risk, which is probably not news to anyone. So we didn't take quite such a broad view for this, but it can absolutely be done. And I definitely agree that it provides a much more complete picture. I should note though, every time I talk about research with the data from the integrated safety response, people wonder, and I do too, about the effects that the interventions could be having and mitigating the outcomes and reducing the relationship between the things we're measuring as predictors and those outcomes occurring. If that's the case, that would be wonderful, but we do know that the rate of services reaching people and then being uptaken is incredibly low, much, much lower than we would like. So even though we have this really great response, we've got a huge, huge problem with reaching people and then obtaining initial engagement and keeping that engagement. And even in the high-risk cases that receive a lot more attention, engagement rates are very, very low.
Thank you so much. And that actually ties quite nicely into another question. So what role do you think that other sectors have for increasing understanding and reporting of coercive controls, such as healthcare, public awareness campaigns, that sort of thing? And my tie to that is that I do think they're knowledge translation person. So I do think knowledge is power, and bridging that gap can also help increase engagement as well.
Yeah, I agree. There's two parts to that question, because embedded in that question is an assumption that reporting is desirable and that identifying coercive control is desirable. Recently, Professor Devlin Polaschek and a colleague at another New Zealand university, Dr. Jacinta Cording and we did a report for the Ministry of Justice where we looked at New Zealand Crime and Survey victim participants who had experienced family or sexual violence, and we compared their wellbeing outcomes from our country has a linked database, so health, education, all of the government databases can be linked. So we compared various outcomes on different measures, and we found really no differences, and it didn't appear that reporting to police resulted in better or worse outcomes. So there's a question mark over the assumption that we want people to report to start with. If these behaviours are indicating of ongoing and escalating harm, and if our responses work to prevent that harm, then yes, sure, we want people to report. But yeah, anyway, answering your question now, I think that there is a place for helping people notice that certain behaviours are not desirable and could be harmful. And I do think there is in media a lot of stuff that is romanticized or celebrated as persistence and no just means not yet, and keep trying rather than yes. And there are some narratives that we need to challenge about what's acceptable in relationships, particularly in heterosexual relationships, but it's still relevant to other relationships too. It does come back to gender roles, of course. And I think there's a place for it in schools. I think there's a place in healthcare. I know I've had my GP ask me, do you feel safe at home? They could ask more about the dynamics with my partner and ask about certain behaviors, like I was suggesting before, Zoe, to unpack that a little bit more. Because really, you can't just ask people, is your partner harming you or controlling you? Because those labels have connotations that don't match with people's perceptions of what's happening with them often, or it might be the way people perceive it 5 years after leaving a relationship. But while in it, it might just be like, whoa, this person really likes me and I'm so lucky. So we have to be careful if we are encouraging people to ask about it, we have to equip them to ask about it in helpful ways. In New Zealand, we had a really pervasive public awareness campaign over the last maybe 15, 20 years, up until stopped a few years ago, which was called It's Not Okay. And it's become part of the local vernacular where we all say it's not okay. And we have really, I think, pretty good reporting rates for family violence on the international scale. But the imagery for those campaigns was always a scary father yelling at the mother with the kids hiding or something like that. And it was very much about violence. And so perhaps if we were to do something like that again, including controlling behaviours and what that could look like, would be a way to make it more relevant, broaden it, and especially including technological forms of coercive control, because that's so common too. And I think in that space, we've got this overlap between police finding it difficult to detect and respond to coercive control, and also the challenges with responding to cyber crimes, and they like come together, and it's just exacerbated.
Oh, that's so many great points there. Thank you so much. And I appreciate the context at the beginning as well, about, some of the negatives of reporting. And I think that's really important to include when we think about the whole picture. So thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions, but is there anything else you would like to add as we wrap up?
I'm sure I'll think of something as soon as we end this call. I guess just to thank everyone again. It's been a privilege to speak with people on the other side of the world and technically in a different day. So there's like time travel happening here too. So thanks everyone for listening, for taking time from your day. I hope that you found it interesting, and I'm happy for anyone to get in touch with me if they would like to.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I just have a couple quick slides to close up, but we really appreciated your presentation and I learned so much, so thank you. So just a quick reminder, the recording and slides will be available post-event on the Waypoint Research Institute website. And again, please complete that post-event survey. It does help us improve future Waypoint Talks events. And lastly, if you would like an attendance certificate, please feel free to reach out to me. My email's there on screen, kallen@waypointcenter.ca, and I'd be happy to send a certificate over to you. So we're going to wrap up this really great series on coercive control on October 21st. We have a session with Dr. T.K. Logan around assessing and addressing the hidden crime of stalking and implications for coercive control. And both of our speakers so far have briefly touched on or mentioned stalking, but we're really going to dive into that in this final session of this series. So with that, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Jolie Simpson. It was wonderful to have you, and have a great rest of your day.